School students in Korea, Taiwan, and other countries have found a more dramatic and affecting form of visibility, capturing the reality of school corporal punishment on their mobile phone cameras and exposing it through Facebook and YouTube. And in case I forget to say it later, as Johnny suggested last night, we do need someone to consider in detail how social networking technology can now be harnessed to add to the force of these campaigns. We should not try and shift responsibility for ending corporal punishment from the adult perpetrators to children. But children are hugely powerful self-advocates, as well as having a right under the CRC to have their views heard and taken seriously. And they are increasingly at least being heard. Finally, in the list of factors making me optimistic is the fact that prohibition is explicitly supported by increasing numbers of international NGOs, professional organizations, and networks of human rights institutions. Save the Children and now Plan International are particularly active. Whilst there are hesitations, it stopped being an untouchable issue for most child-focused organizations. But they have to be signed up to support law reform. Those are the main grounds for my optimism. But now briefly, what are the main challenges and a few tentative pointers to next steps? The biggest challenge remains the personal dimension. Globally, almost everyone, not in this room perhaps, but globally almost everyone was hit and humiliated as a child by their parents. Almost all parents have hit their own growing children. We don't want ever to think badly of our parents or of our childhoods, or of course of our own parenting. And so moving on and seeing this clearly as an issue of equality and human rights is very difficult for most people, including politicians, child protection workers, human rights activists. Then there's the religious dimension, that the strongest and most vocal opposition to banning corporal punishment comes from groups who purport to believe that their religion gives them not just a right, but a duty to hit their children. I won't dwell on this because Chris Dodd will tomorrow. And of course, it's a very positive indicator of progress that a Methodist university should have chosen to support this event so strongly. The lack of acknowledgement of the importance of this issue amongst child protection systems and workers completely maddens me. It really is the elephant in the room of child protection. And again, this must be because of the personal dimension. We have to work to create a child protection consensus that prohibiting violence disguised as discipline is the only safe and just foundation. We need to work on that from this summit. The persisting legality of corporal punishment is, of course, symbolic of children's disempowered status as possessions, not people and rights holders. And it is this status that makes it particularly difficult for children to seek legal remedies for violations of their dignity and physical integrity. So in the UK, as I noted earlier, we've been looking for 2 years for one or more children to make a new application to the European Court to challenge the quite obvious discrimination inherent in the reasonable punishment defense. The difficulty is crazy because there are literally millions of children being reasonably smacked daily. The case is not against their parents, but against the UK government and the law. their identity can be protected. They don't have to play any real part in the action, but it is still proving very difficult. The Global Initiative has started to prepare new style reports on all the states where there is no progress on this issue, quite a lot, setting out how corporal punishment could be challenged by domestic legal action and or by use of external human rights mechanisms which the state has accepted. We think this is the only way to provoke action in many of the states with no progress. We think a starting point everywhere would be to commission a detailed formal legal opinion on the possibilities for challenge. In most cases, these processes will require individual victims, which for children, as I've said, because of adult power, makes them very difficult to use. There are far too few active children's rights advocates and even fewer prepared to engage on this issue. I feel constantly guilty that the obvious things that we could be doing should have done already to increase pressure on governments. But we just don't have the time or money to pay more colleagues to do them. For example, in Europe, to pursue more collective complaints, including against France. Internationally, trying to ensure that the many strong human rights recommendations that we've provoked are actually used properly at national level, and using the communications or complaints procedures that exist internationally in the UN system and are not difficult or expensive to use, but do require finding victims. There seem to be lots of academic courses on human rights law, even on children's rights law, but they don't seem to be producing a new army of active advocates. Why not? We have to remember that achieving law reform ultimately demands achieving majority votes in parliaments. So campaigns, to be effective, need to be equipped to recruit and increase support amongst parliamentarians and fully understand parliamentary processes. In mapping the live opportunities for achieving a ban through bills before parliaments, it often seems that campaigns lack the skills or knowledge to engage effectively with parliaments. It's not that complex, but it seems more training is needed. And while there is more visibility, some of the most grotesque forms of corporal punishment remain largely invisible. We know that penal whipping or caning of children as young as 8 exists in penal systems in more than 40 countries, including highly developed or so-called highly developed democracies like Singapore. But try to find evidence, statistics, victims prepared to challenge it. It's impossible. We need investigative journalists and committed lawyers in many countries. There is strong analysis and dissemination of the overwhelming research evidence against violent punishment, which backs the human rights imperative. Murray, Penny, Joan, Liz, and others have brought it together. But its impact is invariably undermined now when it's used in active campaigns by the spoiling work of isolated psychologists like Robert Lazaire. And similarly, quoting the very positive and scrupulously researched example of Sweden, just becomes a liability when the religious and right-wing family organizations, who are all connected worldwide, circulate gross misinformation about it. It's patiently answered, particularly by Joan, and including by the Swedish government, but the misinformation sticks and serves the purpose of those blocking reform. That's why pursuing law reform first and foremost as a human rights imperative is so important. But we have to find ways to limit the substantial impact of these research cowboys' lawful ways. I am very impatient, as I believe we all should be. I do fear that without explicit and active and increasingly strong and increasingly legalistic advocacy, achieving universal prohibition can still take forever. This doesn't at all mean that it's now a job for lawyers, although they are needed. There are many campaigning roles and, as George said, linked strategies are needed, but there do need to be planned strategies and cunning. Two final points, probably more controversial. Given the accelerating progress, stage by stage, setting by setting approaches to law reform are wrong to me, because the obligation to protect children wherever they are and whoever the perpetrator is an immediate obligation. Such approaches now slow things down. Arguing that schools should not use corporal punishment while keeping quiet about parents means you lose completely the argument of principle, the human rights imperative. It is more or less impossible not to imply, albeit of course unintentionally, that corporal punishment by parents is somehow more legitimate and acceptable. And if you succeed in winning abolition in schools, then you have to start all over again getting support for abolition within the family, where children are still suffering the most adult violence. Don't get me wrong, if there is a legislative opportunity to achieve a ban in schools, of course one goes for it, but in a context which asserts children's right to protection everywhere, which moves us on. And approaches that suggest we should educate teachers and parents away from using violent punishment before we try to address law reform are also insulting to children and confirming of their low status. As several of you have heard me say more than once before, who would argue that we should provide universal employment and universal anger management courses for men before we get round to prohibiting domestic violence against women? For me, the way forward has to be to promote and use human rights, to insist on the logic and justice of universal respect for human dignity and for equal protection under the law, to point to the utter injustice of providing less legal protection from assault to the most vulnerable of people. We have to stop the absurdity of adults clinging to distinctions between violence disguised as discipline and abuse. We have to ensure that violent punishment of children in the home is recognized as part of family or domestic violence and challenged as such. And we have to continue to make ever more visible the daily horrible reality of adults' deliberate punitive violence. Thank you.